They say when you finally make it, when the money starts flowing, when the world begins to notice, you'll feel proud enough to tell everyone. You'll want them to see what you've become. But that's the moment your downfall begins. Because every word you speak about your success is an invitation for someone's envy to take root. And envy doesn't attack you head-on, it corrodes you quietly. The moment you announce your rise, you begin to lose control of it. You see, the truly powerful don't need to announce their wealth. Their influence whispers through rooms long before they speak. The poor man boasts because he needs validation. The rich man remains silent because validation is a weakness. Silence is his armor. Silence protects what greed and jealousy would otherwise destroy. There's something deeply unsettling about the human desire to be seen. We want recognition for our suffering, acknowledgement for our victories. But what Machiavelli understood, and what most people never will, is that visibility is vulnerability. To be seen is to be predictable. To be predictable is to be controllable. The moment you show the world what you have, they begin calculating how to take it from you. Some will come disguised as admirers. Others will pretend to need your guidance. But in truth, they only come to measure you, to see if they can mirror you, manipulate you, or surpass you. The attention you think you've earned becomes the very chain that binds you. The man who learns to move in silence plays a different game. He accumulates wealth not for display, but for control. His riches are not measured in currency but in leverage. He doesn't flash his achievements, he converts them into influence. And while others speak loudly about their success, he studies in the dark, mapping their weaknesses, learning their desires, and preparing his next silent conquest. But here's the paradox: silence isn't natural. It's learned through pain. The poor speak because they want to be heard. The rich stay quiet because they've learned the cost of noise. When you're poor, no one listens, so you talk. When you're rich, everyone listens, so you must choose your words with surgical precision. Machiavelli once wrote that men should either be treated kindly or destroyed, because if you only wound them, they will seek revenge. Apply this to wealth. When you reveal a taste of what you have, you wound others' pride. You awaken their silent rage. They can't destroy you openly, but they will undermine you quietly. They'll smile, congratulate you, and yet, beneath their civility, they'll wait for your guard to drop. That's why true wealth isn't in your bank account, it's in your discipline. The discipline to delay the pleasure of being seen. The restraint to walk among those who underestimate you. The patience to let your results speak long after your silence has confused them. Every empire that fell began with exposure. The Romans flaunted their glory. The kings threw grand feasts. The merchants boasted of their ships. But the wise, the invisible few, built legacies that lasted beyond them because they never allowed others to study their power closely. There's something intoxicating about quiet success. Imagine walking into a room and no one knows you're the most dangerous person there. You sit, observe, and listen as others reveal their motives. You give away nothing, no hint of wealth, no sign of status, no trace of ego. And yet, you pull every string behind the curtain. That is the art of Machiavellian wealth, having everything, showing nothing, and controlling everyone who needs to be seen. When you tell no one about your riches, you gain more than privacy, you gain unpredictability. People can't prepare for what they don't know exists. And unpredictability, Machiavelli knew, is the purest form of power. Because control doesn't come from what others understand, it comes from what they can't read, can't predict, and can't plan against. In time, your silence becomes your weapon. The world will wonder how you did it. They'll invent stories. They'll whisper about your connections, your secrets, your deals in the shadows. Let them. Because their confusion is your camouflage. And the moment they start talking, you've already moved 3 steps ahead, while they're still stuck in curiosity. You will reach a point where your peace becomes your greatest luxury. When you realize that being unseen is the only way to remain untouchable. You'll stop craving recognition, because you'll see what it costs. You'll stop explaining yourself, because you'll realize that understanding is a currency only the small-minded trade in. So when you get rich, when the power, money, and influence are finally in your hands, say nothing. Not out of fear, but out of mastery. Because silence is not absence, it's control. It's the language of those who no longer need to prove anything. And that's where real freedom begins, not when everyone sees your wealth, but when no one can measure it. Wealth doesn't just change your life, it changes the people around you. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly, like water reshaping stone. At first, they'll cheer for you. They'll call you lucky, gifted, or blessed. But beneath their smiles, something darker begins to form. The people who once stood beside you will start to measure the distance between what you have and what they don't. It's not hatred, it's hunger. A hunger that often hides behind politeness, behind admiration. When you grow rich, you'll notice the air around you shifting. Your jokes become funnier. Your presence feels heavier. People start listening not because you're wise, but because you're wealthy. And if you mistake their obedience for loyalty, you're already losing control. Machiavelli warned of this subtle trap, that flattery is the most dangerous poison, because it disguises itself as respect. Every person who knows your success begins to see an opportunity in it. Some will want to use it. Others will want to copy it. A few will want to destroy it, because your existence reminds them of their own failure. That's why silence is not only protection, it's purification. The fewer people who know, the fewer who pretend. The quieter your victories, the more you see the truth behind faces. You will find that most people can tolerate your struggle, but not your success. They can handle your dreams, but not your results. When you were ordinary, you were safe, no one feared you, no one envied you. But once you rise, you become a mirror, reflecting everyone's insecurities. And people do not forgive the mirror for showing them who they really are. There's a certain loneliness that comes with power, but that loneliness is sacred. Because in silence, you start to hear what noise always covered, the true motives of those around you. The one who insists he's happy for you, yet cannot look you in the eye. The one who starts to question your methods, not because they're wrong, but because they work. The one who suddenly remembers your flaws the moment you succeed. Machiavelli would tell you, do not hate these people. Use them. Their envy is a map, it reveals who you must never trust, who you must never confide in, and who you must quietly remove from your circle. To the Machiavellian mind, emotions are tools, not weaknesses. Every reaction others show toward your success tells you how to control them. Gratitude exposes the loyal. Jealousy exposes the greedy. Indifference reveals the wise. And yet, most people will still crave approval. They'll still post, still announce, still shout their wins to a crowd that's waiting for them to fall. That is the tragedy of the modern world. Everyone wants to be seen, but no one understands what visibility costs. Every post, every flex, every brag invites analysis. And where there is analysis, there is weakness. The more they know about you, the easier it becomes to play you. That's why silence isn't just discipline, it's strategy. It's the art of being present but unreadable. The powerful don't hide, they misdirect. They give the illusion of openness while revealing nothing real. They master the art of saying much without meaning anything. Understand this, your wealth doesn't make you powerful. Your secrecy does. Money is just a tool, it buys convenience, it buys options. But secrecy buys control. Because when no one knows where your strength comes from, they can't predict where it leads. They're forced to guess, to react, to follow your shadow. And in that uncertainty, you rule. People think control means dominating others, but it's far more subtle than that. Control is when you decide what others think of you, when you shape their perception without their awareness. You can make them believe you're struggling while you're thriving. You can let them think you're weak while you're calculating. The illusion of vulnerability often hides the sharpest ambition. A true Machiavellian doesn't announce his wealth, he embeds it into his power. He funds the right silence, supports the right whispers, and rewards the right obedience. He moves not through confrontation but through influence, making others believe it was their idea all along. And yet, this quiet dominance comes at a cost: isolation. When you refuse to share your riches, you will lose company. When you refuse to explain yourself, you will lose sympathy. But that's the price of sovereignty. Power doesn't exist where everyone understands you, it exists where no one can predict you. So you must learn to walk alone, not in bitterness, but in mastery. Let your solitude refine you, not consume you. Because when you rise above the noise, you'll discover something most people never reach: the clarity of detachment. You'll stop reacting to opinions, because you'll see them as currency for the weak. You'll stop explaining your silence, because silence doesn't explain, it observes, it measures, it rules. And one day, you'll look around and realize that your life feels peaceful. No noise, no proving, no defending. Just control. You'll see that every secret you kept was a shield. Every silence you maintained was a wall that kept envy out and power in. Because wealth that is hidden grows stronger. It compounds not only in numbers but in control. And the one who controls his exposure controls his fate. So when they ask how you did it, smile. Say little. Let them fill the silence with their own stories. For in their guessing, you remain untouchable. When you learn to treat silence as a weapon, you begin to see the world differently, not as a place of friends and enemies, but as a board of pieces to be moved, unseen. There is an art to this. You must become the calm before storms, the patient observer who knows precisely when to act and when to withdraw. Most people mistake noise for strength, they shout to cover their fear. You must do the opposite. Speak less, listen more, and let your absence create the rumor, the myth, the gap people race to fill with lies of their own making. Imagine this: you walk into a room and leave a void. People notice the silence and start filling it, with guesses, with gossip, with assumptions. Their minds, uncomfortable without a narrative, invent one. And the narratives people invent about you are ammunition you can use. You become the one who shapes perception by omission. You are the composer of other people's stories about you, because you will not give them music to follow. That is control of the highest order, not dictating action, but steering imagination. But mastery of silence demands strategy. You cannot simply disappear and expect power to appear. There are rules, subtle and cold: reveal trivial truths, hide the meaningful ones, allow small, harmless victories to be noticed so you appear ordinary, let others take credit in public while you collect influence in private. The public must believe in a version of you that keeps them comfortable. Behind that veil, you construct a different life, one of leverage, alliances, and contingency. Let them applaud the actor, you will be the playwright. This is where manipulation becomes an art of survival, not cruelty. Use people's expectations against them. Let them see what they expect to see: vulnerability when you are prepared, generosity when you are calculating, humility when you are already sovereign. These are not lies to your soul, they are masks worn for the sake of preservation. Machiavelli taught that appearances are the currency of rule. In a world of weak minds, the person who understands the economy of appearance holds the treasury. And yet, there is an ethical line that the wise must watch. Silence can become a prison if your heart grows numb to everything but strategy. Power without conscience becomes hollow, it breeds paranoia and drains joy. The trick is not to become a shadow at all costs, but to remain human while operating from the shadows. Keep a small circle where truth lives, not for the world to admire, but for your sanity. Let a few people know you in ways that the world never will. These truths will anchor you, preventing the cold rot of ambition from consuming you. You will find, however, that even with a sacred circle, relationships will shift. Lovers and comrades will test the walls you build. Some will complain that you changed, others will celebrate you from a distance until they no longer can. Learn to accept this as natural. People are mirrors of their own needs, they do not stay loyal to the idea of you that no longer serves them. This is not betrayal, it is shedding. Those who remain are either useful, wise, or genuinely rare. Keep them close. Use them wisely. And when necessary, remove those who threaten the structure quietly, as one prunes a tree to allow the strongest branches to flourish. A dangerous facet of hidden wealth is the temptation to prove, to boast in coded ways, to let ego loosen the grip of silence. You will face moments where the urge to show off feels like warmth on a cold night, intoxicating and immediate. In those moments, remember how easily flames reveal the position of a hidden army. Every indiscretion is a map. Every toast announced publicly is an invitation to be charted. If you must celebrate, celebrate quietly, among those whose presence is vetted and whose lips are sealed by interest or fear. Private joy does not need an audience. Understand also that secrecy is not a static posture, it is an active campaign. Keep records private, investments discreet, alliances unmentioned. Control the narrative of your success by controlling the channels of knowledge. Create buffers, legal walls, trusted stewards, intermediary fronts. Wealth exposed directly becomes a target. Wealth invested through layers becomes an enigma. Complexity, when done with intention, protects. It makes theft both costly and uncertain, causing predators to look for easier prey. There will be times when you must be conspicuous for effect. Public philanthropy, a show of generosity, a sacrifice made in the light, these are moves in a long game. Show enough to appear benevolent, but never so much that you reveal mechanisms. Let others believe that your wealth is simple, public-facing, and predictable. Meanwhile, your true power continues to grow in channels they do not see. The public opera masks the private vault. But the greatest weapon the silent wealthy possess is emotional detachment. Not coldness, but disciplined calm. When someone insults you, do not react with the obvious fury. When someone celebrates you, do not be swept into vanity. Respond with composed ambiguity. Let people interpret your behavior through the lens of their own insecurities. Their interpretations will reveal more than their words ever could. From those revelations, you will learn who to trust and who to manipulate, who to elevate and who to ignore. Finally, accept that the truest test of mastery is how you behave when the world thinks you are falling. Let a rumor start, let a false scandal whisper through the crowd. Do not flail. Observe. Quietly correct what must be corrected. Let the storm pass, and when it calms, you will find the field clearer. Those who reveled at your presumed downfall will expose themselves in their haste. Those who remain silent or quietly loyal will show themselves as future pillars. Crises are not merely threats, they are lenses that reveal the architecture of human nature. So wield silence like a blade honed in patience. Use it to confuse, to protect, and to command. But also use it to reflect, to rest, to savor what wealth can buy beyond spectacle. The peace of mind that comes when you know your fate is not in the mouth of a crowd. In that peace, your actions become more deliberate, your choices more sovereign, and your life more truly yours. When you are ready, you will act, not as the loud claimant who demands respect, but as the quiet sovereign whose power needs no announcement. There comes a moment in every ascent where the silence becomes something more than strategy, it becomes peace. You've built, hidden, and guarded what you've earned. You've learned to move through the world like a ghost in daylight, visible but unreadable. Yet now comes the hardest test of all, how to remain untouchable once you have everything. Wealth will test your discipline far more than poverty ever did. Poverty forces humility, wealth tempts arrogance. Poverty silences you because no one listens, wealth demands silence because everyone does. The challenge now is not how to gain power, but how to keep it from consuming you. As your fortune grows, you'll notice how the noise of others becomes unbearable. Every opinion will seek to shape your decisions. Everyone will have advice on how you should live, spend, invest, or give. And if you're not careful, your mind will no longer belong to you. You'll become a puppet of influence, a rich man controlled by the expectations of the poor. That is the hidden trap of success. Once you finally reach the top, the world tries to own your voice. The wise Machiavellian avoids this fate by building a fortress, not of walls and guards, but of solitude. The final fortress is your inner world, the place no one can buy or infiltrate. It's where your motives remain untainted, where your purpose is not for sale. You learn to enjoy without announcing, to win without explaining, to lose without confessing. Most people believe they lose freedom when they're poor. But true freedom is only threatened when you're rich. Because money buys exposure, and exposure invites control. You'll see it in those who flaunt their success, their houses filled with strangers, their lives dictated by attention. They live as slaves to the image they built. They no longer own their wealth owns them. But you will take a different path. You will remain invisible. You will let your fortune grow in the dark, where no eye can distort it, where no envy can reach. You will wear simplicity like armor. You will let others underestimate you. Because the most terrifying man in any room is the one whose power is unknown. The quiet rich understand that privacy is power in its purest form. The moment you reveal your wealth, it stops belonging to you. It becomes a story in someone else's mouth, a topic at another's table. They'll debate how you earned it, what you deserve, whether you've changed. But they'll never understand the cost of your discipline, the nights you bled in silence, the hunger that forged your resolve. And that's how it should be. Let them guess. Let them fabricate. Their noise is proof of your success. But as you ascend higher, remember this truth. If you tell no one when you get rich, you must also learn to tell no one when you suffer. Silence cuts both ways. It shields you, but it isolates you. It keeps your enemies blind, but it also demands you be strong enough to fight alone. That's why the Machiavellian does not seek sympathy, he seeks strategy. He replaces comfort with clarity. He doesn't ask, who will help me? He asks, what will this teach me? Because every loss, every betrayal, every failure that happens in private becomes another layer of armor. While others perform their pain online, you refine yours in the shadows. You learn to convert suffering into vision, setbacks into patience, and fear into control. And that transformation, unseen by all, becomes your most dangerous power. You'll notice that, over time, you speak less. You'll choose your words as a sculptor chooses marble, carefully, intentionally. When you do speak, your silence will have already done half the work. People will lean in when you talk, not because you're loud, but because you've earned the right to be heard. Power is never in the noise, it's in the pauses between your words. You will also understand that generosity, when used wisely, can be the sharpest form of control. Give rarely, give strategically, and give silently. Let your kindness create loyalty, not dependence. When people don't know the depth of your wealth, even your smallest gift feels like an act of grace. That perception is priceless, it keeps them guessing, indebted, and obedient. And through it all, your greatest victory will be mastery of self. Not mastery of others, that comes naturally once you've mastered you. You'll stop chasing recognition because your worth will no longer depend on reaction. You'll stop explaining your success because you'll see that explanation is for the powerless. You'll stop proving your morality because you'll understand that good and evil are tools in the same box, both useful when applied with precision. The moment you can stand in a crowd and feel no need to be seen, that is the moment you've won. When you can sit at a table of powerful men and speak last, knowing you control the tone of every voice before you, that is real dominance. When you can walk away from praise without attachment, from insult without reaction, that is freedom. So when you get rich, tell no one. Let your silence echo louder than their applause. Let your absence disturb more than their presence. Let your peace be the proof that you've risen beyond the need for validation. Because in the end, true wealth isn't the money you make, it's the power to disappear without losing influence. It's the control to choose solitude over spectacle. It's the calm to rule your world without ever needing to announce that you do. And when you finally understand that, you'll see that you were never building a fortune. You were building yourself, into someone so complete, so unshakable, that no opinion, no rumor, no betrayal can touch you. That is the art of the unseen empire. The kingdom that no one can conquer, because no one even knows where it begins. If these words have opened your eyes, if you now see how silence and strength are the same thing, then carry this forward. Build your empire quietly. Let your actions make the noise your words never need to. And if this message spoke to you, if it reminded you of the power you already possess within you, then join us. Subscribe, like, and share this video, not for vanity, but to spread awareness among those ready to stop performing and start mastering. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more quiet power.